Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie. And before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to share with you an experience that we had this week. So, a couple years ago, my daughter and son in law started listening to Ghost, the band, and really liked their music. They went to one of their concerts when they came here to Utah and introduced my husband to the music, and he started listening to it and enjoyed it. This year for Christmas, our kids bought my husband and I tickets to a Ghost concert. They were coming here to Salt Lake, and it was their biggest venue, played in the last 14 years here in Salt Lake. And so we went this past week with our daughter and son-in-law and my brother-in-law and his girlfriend. When they gave us the tickets on Christmas, my daughter said, "Okay, Mom, you need to do your homework between now and February when this concert is." And I said, "Okay, I'll start listening to them." And so I started listening to their music, driving to work, driving home, different times when I was doing something, but not necessarily using my brain, so I could turn on music and listen to it. Lately, with everything that's been going on in the country, with ICE, with the Epstein files, with everything, I've been turning to 80s music that I grew up on as comfort. I've been watching 80s music videos. I've been watching clips of different concerts and seeing the bands through the years. And that has brought a lot of joy for me. I came of age in the 80s. I loved the 80s music. And it's one of the things I do when I need to comfort myself. One of the things I find myself doing over and over again is turning back to the 80s music that I loved. And actually, Ghost reminds me a lot of some of the 80 rock bands. And so I was enjoying it as I did when I was younger. I'm reading about the band, I'm reading about how they came together, how they've grown over the years. Today I have YouTube so I can watch prior performances compared to the one this past week that we went to. And I was thoroughly impressed, had a great experience at the concert. They are very talented musicians. They put on quite the show. And it was just amazing. If you haven't seen them before or heard of them before, start doing your homework because they are currently on tour. And if you can hit up one of their concerts near you, I highly recommend it. It was fabulous. We had read before the concert, you'll have to check your phone, put it in a bag when you're scanning your concert ticket, and not be able to open the bag until you're leaving. So the evening of the concert, our daughter and son-in-law met us at our house. We were going to go out to dinner before heading to the venue. And my husband and I had talked, and we were just like, let's just not take our phones. We don't need our phones. Our daughter gets there, and she was like, "Did you get your phones?" And we were like, "Oh, we're just not going to bring them." And she said, "Well," because their seats were not by our seats. So my daughter said, "Well, how are we going to meet up after the concert?" And my husband said, "We'll just pick a place that we're going to meet after the concert's over out front." And she was like, "But what if we don't find each other?" And he said, "We will." And you could tell she's like, "But I won't be able to text you on your phone." And so I said to her, "Sydney, you're talking to two Gen X people. We never knew where people were, and we always found people. So we are not concerned about this. This doesn't phase us to have to meet up with people and find people and not be able to text them. This is just how we cut our teeth. This is how we grew up." And she's just looking at us like, "Really? You're not taking your phones?" "No, we're just going to leave them home." And so we went. It was no problem. We found a designated meetup spot, found each other right after the concert. It was no big deal. But then when we get back home and we see our phones. Daughter number three had dropped by the house while we were gone, and she texted us on our phones that we're now seeing when we get home. She said, "Where are you guys? Are you okay? What's happening? Why are your phones both here at home? Where would you be without your phones?" We had to text her when we got back. Yes, everything's fine. That was the plan. So everything went great. It was an amazing night. If I am going to be out on a Tuesday night past 10 o'clock, well, really, if I'm going to be outside of my house later than 8 o'clock on a weeknight, it's got to be for something good. I don't commit to being out of my house later than 8 or 8:30 on a weeknight for just anything. But I highly recommend, if you can make it, go to a Ghost concert. I highly recommend it. It was amazing. I was impressed. It was entertaining. It was fun. It was a great night. So I would recommend that you go. Okay, let's get into today's episode. If you've been listening to this series on porn, you know that we've been building up this conversation step by step. And today I want to take us a little bit deeper. Because once we understand the neurobiology, which we covered in episode 1, and once we understand the relational impact, which we covered in episode 2, the next question becomes, what is happening to the self? What happens internally when parts of our lives begin living in secrecy? What happens to authenticity when the person showing up in a relationship no longer reflects what's actually happening inside? Let me start off talking about the development of the authentic self. In intensives I run, I often draw a simple diagram. This one came to me years ago, probably 15 to 20 years ago. I was in a session with a couple. I was trying to explain a concept, or I was trying to talk about this concept in terms of their relational dynamic. And they were not understanding what I was saying. I didn't have good language to make sense of what I was trying to explain. And so I had the thought in my head, I'm going to draw this out. Anytime I have a thought in my head of I'm going to draw this out, there is another immediate part of me that's like, what are you thinking? I don't draw. That is not a talent I have. I wish I did. I don't even doodle well. So when I am thinking I need to draw this out, that's a stretch for me. This is a very simple diagram because, again, lack of drawing skills. But since you can't see it here, if you're listening on the audio, and I'm not going to draw it out if you're watching the video, I'm going to ask you to imagine it with me. So in this diagram, I talk about two expressions of the same person: the authentic self and the relational self. The authentic self is our internal world. It's where wants, needs, fears, beliefs, longings, and vulnerabilities live. It's the part of us that develops when we feel seen enough to be known. The relational self is how we show up with others, whether that's in partnership, in family, or in friendship. And healthy intimacy isn't about choosing one over the other, the authentic self over the relational self. It's not about losing individuality in the name of connection. And it's not about radical self-expression without regard for the impact on others. Healthy intimacy requires alignment. That the person who's showing up in the relationship is an accurate representation of the authentic self, or who we actually are inside. Let me talk about something that I see clinically all the time. Many people never had the chance to fully develop an authentic self. not because something is wrong with them, but because development happens in relationship. And if early on relationships required performance, emotional minimization, or hiding parts of ourselves in order to stay connected, then authenticity doesn't disappear. It just doesn't get practiced. And I'll hear clients say things if I ask them, what are you feeling right now? They don't know what they feel. Or I might ask, what do you need in those situations? They don't know what they need. I'll often hear, I don't want to be a burden. Now, none of this is about personality. These are just developmental adaptations. Sometimes people learned that being good was safer than being honest. Sometimes they learned that vulnerability leads to rejection. And sometimes shame entered the story before curiosity had a chance to develop. When the authentic self doesn't fully form, people don't just stop having needs. Instead, they stop expressing them relationally. And this is where porn can enter the picture in a very specific way. When the authentic self hasn't had safe relational space to grow, parts of a person begin to live privately. And this is where I believe porn can contribute to the formation of a secret life. This isn't a bad self. It's not a fake self. It's just an adaptive self. But let's talk about this more in depth because I think secrecy often gets misunderstood. The secret self isn't usually created out of rebellion. It often starts out of protection. If vulnerability, if expressing needs, if being known feels dangerous, then people learn to separate their internal experiences from their relational presence. So porn becomes a place where curiosity, loneliness, sexuality, or even emotional escape can exist without the risk of rejection. And at first, that secrecy can feel like it's regulating because it's controlled. It can feel safe. But over time, something shifts. The more life that lives inside the secret self, the harder it becomes for the relational self to stay authentic. Now, I also want to connect this back to something we talked about in episode 1, because the secret self isn't just emotional or relational. It's neurological. When porn becomes part of a secret self, the brain starts pairing dopamine with privacy and anticipation. The nervous system learns that relief and intensity live in a hidden space. And over time, that changes more than behavior. It starts to change the authentic identity. The brain begins reinforcing a loop that sounds something like this. When I stay hidden, I feel regulated. When I stay private, I feel relief. And when I move toward authenticity or connection, I feel risk. So the secret self doesn't just exist psychologically, it also becomes neurologically rewarded. And this is why people can say they feel more alive, more energized, or more themselves inside secrecy than they do in relational spaces. It's not because the relational self is false. It's because the brain has learned to associate dopamine with disconnection instead of connection. But here's the hopeful part. Dopamine isn't the enemy. The brain is always trying to move toward meaning, novelty, and engagement. And our brain does like a challenge. Part of healing is helping the nervous system experience that same kind of aliveness through authenticity and relational presence instead of secrecy. This might look like somebody beginning to tell the truth in small ways. It might look like curiosity replacing avoidance. Or it might look like emotional risk being met with safety. The brain will slowly start rewiring what feels rewarding. Dopamine begins attaching not just to anticipation and secrecy, but also to honesty, to connection, and to being fully known. And that's the shift from living primarily in a secret self towards strengthening the authentic self and showing up more fully in the relational self. Now, I mentioned the word compartmentalization, which is a common term with addiction. I often say addiction exists in compartmentalization. So let me say something more about compartmentalization. Compartmentalization is a word that can sound clinical, but the experience is actually very human. And it can also be done in healthy ways. It's the mind's way of putting different parts of life into separate spaces so they don't collide. And in many areas of life, compartmentalizing can be adaptive. We all do it to some degree. It can be healthy. You might set work stress aside so you can be present with your family. Or we might pause emotional processing so we can get through a busy day and stay on task. It can be healthy, but when we learn to do it out of trauma, it tends to be more rigid. It does help us survive and keep moving forward by fracturing different parts of a traumatic experience into different compartments. So in one compartment, you might have the event. In a different compartment might be the emotions, what you felt. And in yet a different category might be the meaning or the belief we made from that experience. By fragmenting them into different parts or different compartments, we're able to survive and we're able to go forward. When porn becomes part of a secret self, instead of helping someone move fluidly between roles and the different compartments, it begins creating internal walls. One part of the person holds the behavior, the curiosity, the escape, the relief, sometimes even the shame. And another part of the self continues showing up relationally, functioning, caring, engaging, trying to be present. And for a while, this separation works, and it can even feel stabilizing. The nervous system learns I can keep these worlds apart. I can protect my relationships by not letting this part of me be seen. But over time, compartmentalization asks the brain to maintain two realities at the same time. And this is where dopamine will start to reinforce the split. The anticipation of secrecy, the predictability of the behavior, and the temporary relief afterward create a neurological pattern where the hidden space becomes more emotionally charged than the relational one. It's not that the person stops caring about their partner or their values. It's that the brain begins associating intensity and relief with privacy or secrecy rather than connection. So the secret self starts to feel more alive, more activated, and even more real. Meanwhile, the relational self can begin to feel flat, more performative. Not because the relationship lacks meaning, but because the nervous system isn't receiving the same dopamine reinforcement in the relationship. And this is where people start feeling divided internally. They might say, I love my partner, and I don't understand why I do this when I know it hurts them. They might say, I feel like two different people. Or it might sound something like, I'm present on the outside, but inside I'm disconnected. What they're describing isn't a lack of integrity. It's the weight of compartmentalization. The brain is trying to keep conflicting experiences from touching each other. And it does this to protect and bring safety. But there is a cost. The more rigid the compartments become, the harder it is for authenticity to move between them. Emotional honesty will feel riskier. Relational presence, therefore, requires more effort. And the authentic self, the part that holds vulnerability and truth, has fewer places to exist openly. When we are talking about healing, we are talking about integration. And integration isn't exposure without safety. It's the gradual process of allowing more connection between these internal spaces. I've heard Dr. Carnes say his definition of serenity, which, if you're familiar with 12 steps, they talk about the serenity prayer. He says serenity is being able to live with all of the compartments open and feel at peace. So, what does this look like as we slowly start to heal? It might look like telling somebody how you're feeling, naming the emotion instead of hiding it. It might look like sharing a struggle before it grows into secrecy. I see this a lot in the groups that I facilitate, which is one of the reasons group therapy is a really powerful component of healing. It may look like letting relational moments carry emotional intensity instead of only the private ones, but intensity that we can tolerate. Over time, as those compartments soften, the nervous system will begin learning a new pattern. It learns that authenticity doesn't have to equal danger, that connection can also hold energy and reward, and that the self doesn't have to be split in order to stay safe. And that's where the movement from a secret self toward a more integrated, authentic self moves into a relational self. Let me give a couple of examples that I'll use when I talk about compartmentalization. Sometimes when I explain compartmentalization, I use the image of a house. Imagine the self like a home with the many rooms that are in a home. And in this home, there's a room for relationships. There's a room for work, a room for memories, a room for sexuality, a room for pain, and a room for joy. In a healthy system, the doors between those rooms can open and close. There's movement between the rooms. There's flexibility, and there's communication between the spaces. But when shame or fear enters development early, certain rooms start getting shut and locked. Maybe the room that holds curiosity gets closed and locked. Maybe the room that holds vulnerability feels unsafe, so we lock it. Over time, one room, the secret room, becomes the only place where certain parts of the self are allowed to exist. And porn can sometimes become the activity that lives in that closed room. Because if we aren't able to move and talk about the other spaces, when we go into that secret room, what else are we going to do? The authentic self hasn't developed. And maybe in this secret room, the lights are brighter. The nervous system is able to come on board and be more active. And because dopamine reinforces what happens inside that space, the brain begins associating that room with aliveness and relief. Meanwhile, the rest of the house stays quiet. Now, this is functional, it's organized, but it's not connected. The problem isn't that the house has different rooms. That's normal. The problem is all of the doors are locked and they stay locked. I'll say, do we need to tear down the house? No, healing isn't about tearing down the whole house or bulldozing every room in the house at once. Healing instead is about unlocking the door, slowly opening the door, and going in and seeing what is in there. I often tell clients, it's a good idea to not go in alone. Take somebody in there who can be a fair witness, who can see what is in there with you. Let the authentic self walk between the spaces, allowing this relational life to hold more truth and helping the nervous system learn that connection can be as alive and meaningful as secrecy once felt. Integration in this example happens when the house becomes one home again. Not perfectly organized. Yes, there's privacy, but it's also connected enough that no part of the self has to live completely alone behind a closed door. Another way to think about this that I will give is like a spotlight inside the brain. And I'll say, dopamine works a little like a spotlight operator. It doesn't decide what's good or bad. It simply learns where to shine based on anticipation, novelty, and relief. Over time, if the most intense emotional experiences happen inside secrecy, the spotlight starts turning toward that hidden space automatically. The secret self feels brighter. There's more light. It's more energized. It's more alive. Meanwhile, relational moments, even potentially meaningful ones, feel dimmer. Not because they matter less, but because the nervous system hasn't been practicing bringing that same level of connection to the relationships. So when someone says, I don't understand why I feel more pulled toward the private space than toward my partner, that's not just about willpower. It's that the brain learned how to shine its light in one room and that it was safe to shine in that room than it was the others. Again, in this example, healing would not be turning off the spotlight. Instead, it would be about slowly and allowing it new places to shine. Whether that's in moments of honesty, moments of emotional risk, or moments when authenticity is met with safety instead of shame. Over time, our nervous system begins associating aliveness, not just with secrecy, but with connection. Before I move on, I also want to speak to another group of listeners, especially young men, who may not currently be in a relationship, but who are noticing the role that porn plays in their lives. I realize that sometimes the conversation around porn gets framed only around betrayal or partnership. And that can make it easy, if you're not in a relationship, to think this doesn't apply to me. But what I see clinically and what research and lived experience continue to show is that patterns built in isolation don't stay isolated. They shape how the nervous system learns to approach intimacy long before a relationship even begins. If porn becomes the primary place where curiosity, sexuality, or emotional regulation happens, the brain starts learning a very specific script. Connection without vulnerability, arousal without negotiation, and stimulation without emotional risk. And at first, that feels easier. It's predictable and safe. But over time, it quietly changes expectations. Real connection begins to feel slower. Eye contact can feel more intense. And the uncertainty of dating or emotional openness can feel overwhelming compared to the control of a private experience. So when young men tell me, I want a relationship, but I feel disconnected when I try, or I don't feel as motivated to pursue someone, I'm not hearing from them a lack of a desire for connection. Often what I hear is a nervous system that has practiced aliveness in solitude more than in relationship. And sometimes they've also started to use substances in order to practice. And I want to be clear, I'm not blaming or shaming, I'm just talking about what I see clinically. And I think this is about awareness, because the same dopamine patterns that I talked about earlier, in the same example, the spotlight, learning where to shine, can start shaping how someone approaches intimacy before they even realize it's happening. It can influence confidence. It can shape beliefs about attraction or performance. And it can even affect how someone interprets rejection or emotional risk. And the danger isn't that someone has watched porn. The danger is when the authentic self never gets the chance to develop relational skills. Skills like curiosity, emotional tolerance, and presence with another human being. Because most of this learning has happened alone. If you're listening and you're not currently in a relationship, I want you to hear this just as an invitation, not a warning. You don't have to wait until you're partnered to start strengthening the authentic self. You can practice authenticity in friendships, in conversations where you say what you actually think or feel. I work with plenty of clients where they start practicing this in therapy. Or you can also start to strengthen that in moments where you choose connection over escape, even in small ways. Because the goal isn't just to stop a behavior so that you can someday enter a relationship. The goal is to develop a nervous system that feels capable of real connection when the opportunity shows up. And when that happens, intimacy stops feeling like something foreign or overwhelming. Instead, it begins to feel like a natural extension of who you are already. And this is where voices like Scott Galloway have started adding an important perspective to the conversation. He shares that nearly half of young men in their late teens and early 20s have never approached someone in person to ask for a date. And I don't bring that up to shame anybody. I bring it up because it tells us something important about development. Relational confidence doesn't grow in isolation. It grows in risk through awkward conversations over time, in moments where you don't know what to say. And yes, it even grows through rejection, recovery, and trying again. And one of the things that Scott Galloway emphasizes, which I agree with, is that resilience isn't built by avoiding discomfort. It's built by practicing it in manageable ways. If the nervous system learns intimacy mostly happens alone, then stepping toward real connection can feel overwhelming. Not because someone lacks desire for relationship, but because the muscles of relational risk haven't had much practice. So part of strengthening the authentic self isn't just reducing secrecy. It's also starting to practice courage in small relational moments. Saying hello, starting conversations, and letting yourself be seen without knowing the outcome. Because every time someone takes a relational risk and survives it, the nervous system learns something new. It learns that rejection isn't annihilation, vulnerability isn't weakness, and that connection becomes possible not because of perfection, but through participation. Now, let me say here, when we hear words like take more risk, it can sound sometimes like pressure, especially for people whose nervous systems already feel overwhelmed. From an attachment and nervous system perspective, what we're really talking about isn't forcing yourself into big dramatic moments. We're just talking about expanding your window of tolerance for connection. Every small relational risk, saying hi, starting a conversation, making eye contact, smiling, asking a question, expressing interest, gives the brain new data. It teaches the nervous system that closeness doesn't always equal danger, that uncertainty doesn't automatically mean rejection, and that emotional exposure can be survived. So when we talk about resilience, I'm not just talking about becoming tough or less sensitive. No, we're talking about helping the authentic self grow strong enough to stay present, even when connection feels uncertain. I'm working with a young adult male client, and he's going to classes. There's some girls he's noticed. He said hi. He even has asked one out for coffee after class, and they couldn't make it. And he was telling me about it, and he's like, I don't know, I just feel awkward. And I said, that's okay. Still say hi. He was saying, maybe I just won't sit by them. And I said, maybe, but not forever. You can sit by them again. This isn't a no. She said she couldn't do it that day. You just have to keep showing up, keep going to class, say hi, smile, make eye contact, ask, what are your plans today? Start the conversation, getting to know them. Because this is where the shift from a secret self toward a relational self really begins. Not through perfection and not through willpower alone, but through repeated experiences where authenticity meets enough safety that the nervous system learns a new pattern. Because resilience isn't the absence of discomfort. It's the ability to stay connected to yourself while you're moving through the discomfort. Now let's talk about the relational self for a moment. Because as someone begins taking those small relational risks, or on the other side, when those risks are avoided and more of life stays inside secrecy, it doesn't just affect the individual experience. It affects how others perceive you, whether you're available or approachable. It also shapes how a person shows up in connection. The relational self is the part of us that partners experience day to day. The tone of our presence, the openness in conversation, the willingness to stay emotionally engaged, even when things feel uncertain. And when more of someone's internal world starts living behind closed doors, when compartmentalization grows stronger, the relational self can begin to feel different to the people closest to them. Not dramatically different, often just subtly. Partners may notice less curiosity, fewer spontaneous conversations, a sense that connection feels more functional than alive. And they may not know why something feels off. They may not have language for what's happening internally for the other person. Often, all they notice is a shift in presence. And this is why so many partners say that they felt the disconnection long before they ever discovered a behavior. Because relationships don't just respond to what is visible, they respond to alignment and misalignment between the authentic self and the relational self, or the absent self. So as we move back into talking about partners' experiences, I want to hold this with compassion for both sides of this. Because what partners notice isn't just secrecy. They're often sensing the nervous system working hard to keep different parts of the self separate. And that effort changes the feeling of connection, even before anyone understands exactly why. The relational self is what partners experience. Like I said, it's the tone of voice, the presence in conversations, and the willingness to actually engage and be available emotionally. When porn lives inside a secret self, the relational self often becomes more performative than authentic. And here's the part that often goes unspoken or unknown. Even when a door in that house stays closed, the people living in the relationship still feel that something has shifted. Partners may not know what room is closed. They may not know what's happening behind that closed door. But they do feel a change in energy. They don't just respond to information that's known by the brain, but they respond to the feeling, even though they doubt it. And so this is often why partners begin questioning themselves. They wonder if they're asking too much, if they're being too sensitive, if the distance they feel is somehow their fault. What partners notice often isn't behavior. They notice misalignment. They notice when the person in front of them doesn't quite match the emotional presence that they used to know. And if we can understand this, it helps us move the conversation away from blame and toward understanding how secrecy and compartmentalization impact both people in the relationship, even before words exist for it. And this is usually the moment where shame shows up. For the person struggling, shame can sound like, I'm broken, I'm bad, I've ruined everything, and if my partner really knew me, they wouldn't stay. For partners, shame sounds different, but it's still there. It often sounds like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not enough? How did I miss this? Shame often tries to simplify a very complex human experience into one painful story. And that story is often that someone is fundamentally flawed, usually the person experiencing shame. But responsibility is often an antidote to shame. Where shame shuts down, responsibility opens it. Shame pushes people deeper into secrecy, which only strengthens the secret self. Responsibility invites the authentic self to come forward slowly and safely. And because healing isn't just about removing porn from someone's life, healing is also developmental. This is where the work becomes developmental again. Because moving from secrecy toward integration isn't about proving that you're a good person. It's about learning how to stay present with discomfort long enough to understand what's actually happening inside. Responsibility sounds more like this behavior impacts my nervous system. It impacts my partner. It impacts my relationships. And I want to understand why it became part of my life. That shift from shame to curiosity to responsibility is often the first moment where the authentic self begins stepping out from behind the closed doors. Not perfectly and not all at once, but it can do it honestly. And the goal isn't exposure for the sake of exposure. The goal is exposure for integration. It's strengthening the authentic self so that internal experiences and relational presence begin to align. It's learning to tolerate vulnerability, learning to name wants and needs, and learning to show up relationally in ways that reflect the truth of the internal world. And this is work I see happen slowly. It takes time. It's not perfect, and it takes practice. Practice with honesty, practice with repair, and practice with being seen in ways that once felt unsafe. Now let's talk about what shame actually does, not just emotionally, but also neurologically. Because shame doesn't just hurt, shame organizes the nervous system. When someone feels shame, the brain shifts into protection mode. The nervous system begins scanning for threat. Not just external threat, but relational threat. Will I be rejected? Will I be exposed? Will I lose connection? And when the brain perceives that kind of risk, compartmentalization often becomes stronger. The doors inside that house we talked about earlier don't just stay closed, they lock more tightly. The secret self becomes more isolated. The relational self works harder to just appear okay. And the authentic self, the part that holds vulnerability, has fewer safe pathways to move between those spaces. And this is why shame so often reinforces the very patterns people want to change. Because shame tells the nervous system, hide more, protect more. Don't let anyone see this part of you. And neurologically, that creates more distance between internal experience and relational presence. It's not that someone doesn't care, and it's not that they lack integrity. It's that the nervous system is trying to prevent relational rupture, even when the strategy ends up creating more disconnection over time. But responsibility works differently. Responsibility activates curiosity instead of collapse. It just gives us a pause before we go back into retreat. When we can say to ourselves, I want to understand this. the brain begins shifting out of a pure threat response and into a learning mode. And that's where integration becomes possible. Because integration doesn't happen through pressure. It happens when the nervous system experiences enough safety to let those internal doors open a little bit wider. And when honesty is met with grounded presence, when accountability is paired with compassion, when the authentic self begins stepping forward without being overwhelmed by shame, that's often the moment that compartmentalization begins to soften. Not because we forced it open, but because the nervous system finally believes connection can survive truth. This is where the conversation begins to shift from just understanding to rebuilding. Because once we recognize how compartmentalization forms and how dopamine reinforces secrecy, and then how shame strengthens the split between internal and relational life, the question becomes, what actually helps the self come back into alignment in ways that feel real and sustainable? Integration doesn't mean erasing parts of yourself. It means allowing more honesty to move between the rooms of your internal world. It means the authentic self becoming strong enough to exist not only in private spaces, but also in relational ones, where connection requires presence, curiosity, and emotional risk. And this is slow work. Like I said, it might look like telling a small truth instead of hiding it, sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it, and letting someone see a part of you that once only lived in secrecy. For the person struggling, integration often begins with learning that accountability doesn't have to equal annihilation. And for partners, integration may mean learning how to stay connected to your own authentic self, your boundaries, your needs, your voice, even as trust is being rebuilt. Because healing isn't about perfection. It's about alignment. Alignment between what you feel internally and how you show up relationally. And as that alignment grows, something shifts in the nervous system. Connection starts to feel less threatening. Presence and connection start to feel more alive. And intimacy becomes something that can be experienced, not managed, not controlled. As I wrap up today, I want to summarize what we've covered so far in this series, as well as what we're still going to cover. In episode 1, we talked about regulation, how porn can become a nervous system strategy. In episode 2, we explored relational impact and how secrecy and emotional absence shape intimacy and partners' experiences. And then in this episode, episode 3, we went deeper into development of the self, how compartmentalization forms, how a secret self emerges, and how integration begins. And we're not done yet. In episode 4, we're going to move into what rebuilding looks like, how people begin reconnecting with their authentic self, and how couples start creating relational safety again after secrecy. And then possibly in episode 5, we'll explore what long-term integration looks like. The ongoing work of emotional presence, resilience, and creating relationships that feel more aligned and grounded over time. Relationships that have sustainability. Before I close, I also want to invite you into this conversation. If this episode brought up questions, thoughts, or reflections, I've added a space in my link tree where you can send a message or even leave a voicemail for the podcast. You're welcome to stay anonymous because sometimes the questions that we're most hesitant to ask are actually the ones that help others feel less alone. But if you want to stay anonymous, just tell me you want to stay anonymous in your voicemail or in your question. I'd love to hear what you want to add. If you're okay having your voice on, I'd love to play some voice recordings. And at the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.